I think now we should broaden the discussion. We also have here today with us Congressman André Carson, who represents Indiana, and we have Congressman Emanuel Cleaver, who represents the great state of Missouri. And Congressman Cleaver also, of course, chairs the Civility Caucus. So when you think about what Congressman Clyburn just said, which is this is all foolishness, and we know that folks are playing on public fear, and so much so, right, we have a presidential candidate, Donald Trump, who has used some of that public fear to talk about a ban on Muslims. One that Congressman Carson has impacted you directly. You received a death threat on Monday. Talk to us about that.
Well, it's one of many death threats I've received since I came to Congress. I think what highlighted this threat was that in the midst of an environment of such deep toxicity, it's important to note that people are being manipulated by the kind of demagoguery we're seeing from Mr. Trump. Listen, I've met Mr. Trump before. I've read most of his books about the direction of this country. You now have this growing restoration movement, if you will, of taking our country back to some mythological good old days. And I think he's speaking to that crowd. His poll numbers are up, his focus group results are great, and he's trying to secure a position. But I think the American people are smarter than that.
I hope so. but some of the polling indicates otherwise, at least when it comes to GOP primary voters. So Congressman Cleaver, I think particularly given the fact that you have this platform as being a co-chair of the Civility Caucus, how much more important is civility now, given the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing and the types of threats we're seeing for other, not just the two Muslims in Congress, but for those who live and just dwell in our American citizens? Well,
if we cannot, as members of the governing bodies of the United States, communicate with one another in a decent kind of fashion, if our language ends up becoming language to inspire hate, then I think that we become more and more irrelevant. And the polling on the United States Congress and on politics in general is going downhill. Donald Trump will not bring us up the hill 1 inch. In fact, it's almost in a free fall the more he speaks. The most common disease that afflicts humanity is fear. Mr. Trump is very well aware of it, and so he is using it very, very intentionally, because he understands that if he can get people scared, that they will, in many instances, even throw away their own security, their own freedoms, in order to feel secure.
So what's interesting to me, though, is that he has this platform to say this, but you all have colleagues in the House who echoed some of the very same sentiments and have used similar rhetoric, whether we're talking about Syrian refugees or immigrants when we were trying to get the comprehensive immigration reform done. So what does that say about really some of the members of Congress? We know they represent the interests of their district, but should there be greater accountability for the words they're speaking as well, even if they don't have the same platform as Donald Trump, Mr. Clyburn?
Well, you have to judge people by their individuality here. The fact of the matter is, every congressperson represents a congressional district that's defined by redistricting, and everybody knows that in the last redistricting, you saw more gerrymandering going on than you've ever seen before, where you've made all of these districts safe for a lot of that sort of rhetoric to take place, and then enhance their standing among the voters in that district, though it will not do anything for the country of a positive nature going forward. So that's the thing that we're in right now, and we'll have to get adjusted to it.
Okay, so let's switch gears just a little bit, because we are getting ready to go into the holidays, and it sounds like Mr. Clyburn saying you all will go home one time. But one of the things that I would love to hear from you all and have you share with the viewers is what you think will happen next year in this Congress. So you have an election year coming up. We know that once the elections and the primaries are underway, it'll be difficult to get anything done. But what do you think will get done in the first quarter of next year?
Well, I do believe we'll have some bipartisanship on some issues. Judicial reform is going to take place. I don't think it will go as far as any of us would like, the three of us anyway, but I think there's a very good possibility that we see some reform taking place, because we know that our judicial system is at the crossroads. And I believe it'll happen. Beyond that, not much, because everybody will be posturing themselves for re-elections, and the presidential thing will overshadow all that we do. But I think that that there may be a couple of other little things, but the big thing, that's the one big thing I think will get done.
Okay. What about you?
Well, I don't think a lot's going to get done for the same reasons that the leader just mentioned. However, I think the American public could become extremely damaged, as well as the political process, because this presidential campaign, if it continues as it's going now, is going to further divide this country. People are going to come to Congress for the purpose of espousing the kinds of things that seemingly are acceptable to the public. Mr. Trump is mouthing some things that a lot of people apparently believe just won't, and were reluctant to say. And he creates this fear, and fear breeds bigotry. And when bigotry is at work, I think the whole country is in jeopardy.
I agree with my mentors. Much won't get done legislatively, but on the ground, Angela, my hope is that we'll see a movement of people who are showing up to the polls, following the rhetoric that's taking place, and either keep in people like Clyburn and Cleaver, and vote out people who, like Stephen King, who are making inflammatory statements that are just stirring the pot of bigotry.
So on that, you just brought up voting. So for me, it's like the no-brainer, and I think probably my biggest frustration with the controlling party in the House right now is voting rights. Right. We know that Section 5 was gutted. We saw the fallout from that with what just happened in Alabama. What do we do with the challenge on voting rights? Is there any way, I mean, do we need to go back out into the streets and protest? Is that the only way this is going to happen?
Well, that may be part of it. I do believe that we are reliving a lot of what we experienced back in the 60s, and it may require that we go back to the streets. That's what they're doing in Chicago, and I think that is beginning to work very effectively. If people will refuse to sit down around the tables, work through, get to compromises on issues like on voting rights, then it may be that it's time for us to go back to the basics.
And I think the one thing that we can just hold on to, Congressman Cleaver, as I know you mentioned this, is there are 57% of the American people, when you combine both parties, that don't agree with Donald Trump. And so there is a little bit of hope. So maybe we can reach the consciousness of the American people if we can't with their elected officials. So I thank you all so much for joining me for this segment.